If I may, I'd like to start with a personal story concerning the pace and the nature of change. In the spring of 1961, I'd recently joined an advertising agency named Greenleys, part of what was then rather grandly described as the Lonsdale Hands group of companies. I was an assistant account executive, which in those days was the lowest form of human life in the advertising food chain, working on, among other things, the John Collier account, the window to watch, as our ads proudly claimed. In order to find out a little more about my client and hopefully to impress my new bosses, I started spending the odd Saturday morning at any branch of John Collier that was within a bus ride of where I lived in North London. The principal appeal of the chain was that you could buy a suit for £9.99, which was all but indistinguishable from its slightly upmarket equivalent at Burton the Tailor's, which sold for a couple of quid more than that. I quickly discovered that my client's secret was twofold: to have a reasonably attractive female assistant available whose task was to make approving noises whenever the customer looked at his reflection in the mirror, and a tailor, and I put that entirely appropriately in quotation marks, a tailor whose skill lay in reassuringly touching the small of the customer's back while simultaneously grabbing a handful of superfluous fabric in order to enhance the fit of the jacket as he stared in the mirror. Now, not only was this whole thing an increasingly dispiriting experience, but it entirely failed to impress my superiors, who found my out-of-hours enthusiasm for the new job entirely eccentric. Another task entrusted to me was that of collecting the suits that had been especially prepared for photography from Kilgore, French and Stanbury in Savile Row, and taking them to the studio. Yes, you heard me correctly. The suits that appeared in our £9.99 ads were actually made at what was then the most famously expensive tailors in London. The photographs, if you could call them that, because they were so heavily retouched that by the time they appeared in the press, they might just as well have been drawings. These photographs were taken in a Chelsea studio by an elderly but elegant figure. I say elderly, he's probably younger than I am now, but he seemed at the time to be elderly, rather elegant man, whose, as a young man, his principal claim to fame was he'd won the Diamond Sculls at Henley. Now, he was also able to magic up tickets for international rugby matches at Twickenham, which made him twice as important a figure in the eyes of my immediate bosses and a lot more important than me. However, by then, I'd started buying a new magazine entitled Town, published by Michael Heseltine, and featuring men's fashion photography by someone named Terence Donovan. His men actually appeared to be able to move in their clothes and inhabit what you could term as real lives, and I was so impressed that I dared to suggest that we attempted something similar. And that was the beginning of the end of my very short career at Greenleys. But it was precisely the stimulus I needed to locate and eventually join a brand new ad agency, Collett Dickinson Pierce, as their very first assistant account executive. By 1963, that's just 2 years later, British society had been turned absolutely upside down. And not only had I found myself in the right place at the right time, but Greenleys, in fact the entire Lonsdale Hands organisation, were well on their way to the knacker's yard. Now I tell this story because I sincerely believe us to be in the throes of an equally monumental societal change, but one that this time goes well beyond consumer behaviour, one which, if not properly understood and addressed, has, in my judgment, the capacity to change the lives of all of us living in what we thought of as comparatively stable Western democracies. And the question I want to pose this evening is this: do we have it within us to learn from our recent past and change the direction in which we would appear to be heading? And can we do that before it's too late? And I want to pose that question through the prism of two recent events, both of which, to my mind, perfectly exemplify the challenges and the opportunities that are currently available to us. The events I'm referring to are the soon-to-be-published Leveson Inquiry and the recent Olympic and Paralympic Games. For me, these two seemingly very disparate events perfectly symbolize alternative visions of the future, or if you prefer it, visions of two Britons. So let's start with Lord Justice Leveson's inquiry. 10 years ago, one of my colleagues in the House of Lords, Baroness Honora O'Neill, delivered a seminal series of wreath lectures entitled A Question of Trust, which quickly became a touchstone for many people, not least in universities such as this. Had it enjoyed a similar influence on the proprietors and the editors of sections of our national press, we most certainly would never have needed this most recent inquiry into the culture, the practice, and the ethics of the press. Because the debate about the press, and about media more generally, is essentially all about trust and the vacuum that's created when it ceases to exist. Few of us could possibly have imagined, when the news became public that Millie Dowler's phone had been hacked, that the result would be a horrifying and long drawn-out exposure of sections of the UK media, and one that at times has quite beggared belief in its descriptions of criminal behaviour by those who, for many years, had acted as though they were all but untouchable. Now, it's understandable they come to feel that way with regard to a self-administered Press Complaints Commission, but a great deal more troubling in the case of their relationship with the long arm of the law. Here was a relatively small but immensely powerful clique of people who appear to have acknowledged no rules other than those that accelerated their personal and their political ambitions. In an article for The Observer in July 2011, I referred to this group as behaving like the Stasi. And nothing's happened in the past 16 months to persuade me that that wasn't a wholly justified description of what had become a systemic pattern of behaviour. More disturbingly, it quickly became evident that this wasn't simply about an out-of-control media. No, these continuing behavioural patterns, with their pragmatic self-justifications, had leached far deeper into civil society, into the police, into politics, in fact, into just about every nook and cranny of British public life. A few years ago, when I was travelling the world as president of UNICEF, I found myself in countries where the notion of democracy, certainly as we know it, was, to put it mildly, something of an abstraction. At the time, I concluded that as long as a nation could develop a reasonably well-trained, honest and impartial judiciary, it would eventually manage the incredibly difficult, sometimes even painful transition to a fully functioning nation-state. However, the trail of deception, as it began to emerge from the Leveson Inquiry, made me begin to question that assumption. I was forced to come to terms with the fact that once the media, politicians and the police begin to collude with each other, or discover a shared agenda that's neither transparent nor necessarily in the best interest of the public at large, at that point, even the finest judiciary in the world is rendered effectively powerless. The toxic triangle of a needy and fragile politics that believes itself dependent upon or simply in thrall to an element of the media, an element that in turn has managed to infiltrate the very highest levels of law enforcement, once those relationships have become corrupted, then the game is effectively up for the rest of us. I understood for perhaps the very first time that taken together, these seeming pillars of society form an intricate and interrelated ecology, and that the development of malign intent in one leads almost inevitably to the corruption of the others. I've not even brought into this equation an irresponsible to the point of reckless financial community, seemingly contemptuous of the political and regulatory systems that were set up to keep it in check. This is a community that not only regarded itself as operating beyond the law, but continues to bask in the leniency of a legal system that finds it impossible to come up with penalties that offer visible recompense for the despair and the destruction that resulted from their actions. I find personally that it's very difficult to explain to a young person caught up in last year's mindless rampage that the resulting severe sentences and the blighted future that comes with them is in some way comparable to a sharp-tongued and momentarily embarrassing appearance before a fairly impotent parliamentary committee, which was the fate of even the most irresponsible of our leading bankers. And as we've all now discovered, when under oath, far and away the best defence for so-called white-collar crime is convenient amnesia, the number of examples of memory loss under public interrogation in this past year alone could well be regarded as having reached epidemic proportions. In fact, if anyone here has a vaccine, they could make a lot of money, or perhaps not, since this would appear to be an affliction in which the many of its victims appear to find great comfort. No, the British legal system has, for far too long, been ridiculously soft on white-collar crime, possibly because those who've made the laws lived cheek by jowl with those who manipulated them. You've got to admit, it is a strange world in which the penalty for stealing a television set out of a shop window can be vicious, whilst the penalty for stealing the financial security of an entire country is little more than a slap on the wrist. I wonder if, when the next outbreak of rioting erupts, someone will take the time to explain what I see as an apparent legal paradox. I'd argue that recent events have revealed this disparity of treatment to be entirely indefensible. It's my personal hope that maybe, just maybe, the next Labour government might decide to ignore the inevitable threats of the flight of capital and do something about ensuring that visible justice becomes available without fear or favour, as to a certain extent various administrations have historically managed in the United States. What's certain is that new and far tougher penalties for white-collar crime are urgently required here in Britain. No doubt that old and well-worn threat, key people will leave the country, will be trotted out time and again, but I doubt you'll find many of those altogether admirable Olympic volunteers or games makers among those fleeing hordes, unless they're simply seeking the type of future a generation of grubby and incompetent bankers have all but destroyed for them. I'm sure we haven't heard the last of the failures of the financial community, but in the meantime, Lord Leveson and his colleagues are attempting to rebalance at least one aspect of our corrupted ecology by successfully exposing some of the ugly entrails that lie at the centre of what we thought of as having been the establishment. In some respects, what I've laid out as the charge sheet, if you like, could justifiably be labelled as a somewhat simplistic overstatement. But then overstatement is the stock in trade of any self-respecting former ad man. So if it requires an overstatement to get across the gravity, along with the full implications of what Leveson has already uncovered, then so be it. We, as a country and as a society, were unquestionably being led down a road that, far from benefiting the many, not the few, as politicians of all parties are fond of claiming, was principally designed to line the pockets and enhance the clout of the already entitled, at the expense of a far more deserving majority, that's to say, the bulk of the electorate. But the really interesting thing that's emerged over this past year or so is that this triangle, or troika might be a better word, have not only been misrepresenting and manipulating the ordinary people of this country, but they've been doing it in a manner that's both damaging and profoundly inaccurate. Now, on what basis do I make that assertion? I base it largely on the experience of watching and visiting our amazingly inclusive Olympic and Paralympic Games. From the moment the Olympic flame touched down on these islands, with the extraordinary and, let's admit it, quite unexpected levels of enthusiasm it generated, it became impossible to even brush up against those thousands of Olympic volunteers without being struck by the innate politeness, consideration, efficiency, effectiveness of swathes of our countrymen and women. Can this possibly be the same nation that has for so long been reflected or refracted day in and day out in many of our sensation-seeking, voyeuristic, celebrity-obsessed tabloid newspapers? To the degree that, as the columnist Simon Jenkins recently put it, the media appeared to have gone collectively tabloid. Now, when I was young, there were the daily and the Sunday newspapers, and then there were weekly entertainments such as Reveille and Titbits. Nobody ever confused the two. The editor of Reveille was very unlikely ever to be offered the editorship of a genuine newspaper. Sadly, in some cases, they've now all become indistinguishable. In effect, we've got Titbits opining on Europe and Reveille telling us how to get the economy back on track. And if you step back for just one single moment, you begin to see how absolutely daft we've allowed ourselves to become. This is a world in which words get distorted and mangled to a point at which they lose all meaning. Words like fair, respect, kindness, sacrifice, value. This is a world in which, once money is involved, shame and embarrassment appear to have ceased to be any kind of brake on bad behaviour. And against that, did the performance of a single Olympian or Paralympian in any way shame or embarrass anybody? I'd be very, very surprised if that were the case. For anyone of my age who had begun to believe that the best of the qualities to which I've just referred had all but died out with my parents' generation, our Olympic summer was nothing short of a revelation. Pierre de Coubertin, father of the modern Olympics, famously said that for him the Olympics was all about taking part and doing the best you possibly can in fair competition with other athletes from across the world. And it's been my dream to take that notion one stage further and to make it, if you like, even more real. This is just an aside, but I've long believed that there should be a fourth plinth at every victory ceremony, reserved for the athlete who in each discipline has exceeded their personal best by the greatest margin. Life doesn't offer any of us the opportunity to do more than our best. And I can think of no better way of driving that point home than by celebrating those who have achieved exactly that. I believe they're entitled to have their own medal, which might in turn prove a very intelligent way to begin to unhook ourselves from our present rather juvenile conception of success. And it's with that spirit of the Olympics in mind that surely I can't be alone in feeling angry at the way in which, for well over 20 years, and without any apparent sense of irony at the extent of their own mendacious hypocrisy, sections of the media have been exploiting the rest of society. I'm angry at the predatory manner in which they pounced on our frailties, exploited our weaknesses, preyed on our fears, fanned our petty jealousies, and trumpeted our inadequacies, and all in the guise of freedom of expression. The only way one only has to look at what we now know went on in relation to the Sun's coverage of the Hillsborough tragedy to see it as part of a systemic pattern of behaviour. Now, why does all this matter? Well, I think it matters because I believe Britain, not much over a year ago, came frighteningly close to a kind of silent putsch. And ironically, it was only the tragic death of Millie Dowler and the media frenzy that followed that allowed us at last to get a long, long look at what had been going on. And most reasonable people discovered that they really didn't much like what they saw. I'm the son of a newspaperman. I have a blood tie to the notion of a free press that's every bit as great as that of Elizabeth Murdoch. But as she emphasised in her recent and altogether excellent McTaggart lecture, with great power comes great responsibility. And that being unarguably true, the crucial question becomes, has the great power of the press been handled with appropriate levels of responsibility, let alone empathy? Most of the evidence gathered by the Leveson Inquiry would suggest this to have been far from the case. The Prime Minister recently made the point that it is personal responsibility that lies at the heart of our criminal justice system. And of course, he's absolutely right. Similarly, I'm sure I wasn't the only person here this evening to experience an overwhelming sense of admiration at his handling of the Bloody Sunday and more recently, the Hillsborough apologies. Nor could I have been alone in finding his use of the phrase double injustice, a phrase which I understand he personally coined, to be absolutely profound. So surely the political and social catharsis generated by those two announcements, Hillsborough and Bloody Sunday, should encourage politicians of all parties to see that there are very real alternatives to the traditional world of cover-up and evasion. To my way of thinking, in response to the Queen's Jubilee, that public outpouring of affection that preceded the miracle of the Olympics makes it very clear that we've reached a watershed in deciding the type of nation that we in the United Kingdom want to be, and indeed the type of nation that we would wish to be seen to be. So encouraged by the spirit of the London Olympics and buttressed by Lord Leveson's forensic investigation, I'd like to believe that we are beginning the process of recovering a sense of common purpose, and with it, an altogether more optimistic vision of our future. Given the lessons learned from those recent experiences, it seems reasonable to hope that the Prime Minister, having caught the zeitgeist and understanding the possibilities opened up by a new type of visible justice, will not allow himself to become the latest in that long line of well-intentioned leaders who, when push came to shove, buckled in the face of media intimidation. He has a unique opportunity to take the side of those who want to clean the stables against those whose sole objective is to continue to make hay in the way they always have, whereby in their desire to shock and stupefy, they've managed to become the actual enemies of the possibility of social harmony. The type of society that we very briefly glimpsed during those magical Olympic and Paralympic weeks. As I say, we have arrived at an important watershed, and Lord Leveson and his colleagues are in the process of finalising some incredibly fine and important judgments that could have a profound effect on British society for years to come. As I see it, a great deal hangs on which Britain he decides to go into bat for. He'll have been assured by the press barons that hard lessons have been learned, that the newspaper industry will clean up its act, but that any form of statutory regulation will be an arrow aimed at the heart of democracy, that a vigorous press cannot possibly be held accountable for its accuracy, and that in today's world it's impossible to clearly differentiate between comment and opinion. Indeed, it's no surprise that many newspapers are already supporting the plan put forward by Lord Black of Brentwood for a form of self-regulation based on commercial contracts. In truth, it is not, as some would have it, a new system entirely. It effectively allows newspapers to buy themselves out of regulation, and its powers of sanction are limited and thoroughly unspecific. In short, like other calls for self-regulation, this is simply special pleading, intended to return matters to the old and comfortable status quo as quickly and as painlessly as possible. And when the most powerful proprietor of them all invokes the extraordinarily offensive phrase scumbag celebrities to describe some of those who were illegally hacked by his employees, it's the surest possible sign that he, for one, wants to return to the status quo ante in pretty short order. Without the backstop of some form of legislation, whatever system of regulation Lord Leveson recommends can only be as robust and as honest as its most reluctant participant. Again, to rapid and affordable access to justice must be guaranteed. I searched the evidence obtained by the inquiry for signs that serious journalists, as they move between print and broadcast media, find the regulatory environment of the latter in any way inhibiting. I could find absolutely none. Similarly, ask a British editor why it is that American newspapers and magazines, protected as they are by their First Amendment rights, continue to employ fact-checkers, and you'll find it very, very hard to get a coherent explanation. And the truth is that the British press and its editors have to become as accountable as the rest of civil society. They are not a special case, and they've only themselves to blame for having lost the argument for exceptionalism, and with it, the right to self-regulation. It's also the case that journalists need to be able to trust their editors and proprietors not to pressure them into cutting corners or into using illegal methods to obtain stories. Even Rupert Murdoch made a short and somewhat grudging reference to the need for some sort of an agreement of this sort. At the very end of his second Leveson appearance, he agreed that a provision which forbids editors or proprietors to discipline a journalist who refuses to do something which is unethical or against the code of practice would be a good idea and could be incorporated into the employment contract of every journalist. But without any agreement of this sort, this sort of contract is pretty worthless, unless it's supported by some form of statute that obliges the proprietor to honour his side of the bargain. As I was told last week, in the recent past, should you ever summon up the courage to complain about anything of this sort on a newspaper, you didn't necessarily get the sack, but you did very quickly find yourself doing the television listings. I suggested earlier that what we've been encouraged to think of as the individual and self-sustaining pillars of freedom are, in fact, a very intricate ecosystem, all of which are required to prove themselves capable of trust and behave with equal probity, or, quite inevitably, each will infect the other until all have become corrupted. If I may, I'd like to finish with a very short extract from my favourite book, T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which I think speaks both to the opportunity for this to be a very different kind of country, but also to the danger that should we fail to be vigilant, should we fail to take heed of the lessons we've already learned, we could lose all the ground that's there to be won. In 1926, looking back on the broken dreams and broken promises that followed the Allied victory in World War I, Lawrence wrote this: "The moral freshness of the world to be intoxicated us. We were wrought up in ideas to be fought for, and yet, when we'd achieved and the new world dawned, the old men came out again and took our victory to remake it in the likeness of the former world they knew." Lord Leveson and his colleagues are being asked to map out the changes we have to make in order to ensure that the old men and women are not able to force us back to the former world they knew. In the past few months, we've established that much of that world was rotten. As we more recently remembered, we are capable of being far, far better than that. And here we get to the heart of the matter. Nothing is likely to change without the politicians and the press themselves making it clear that they, every bit as much as us, want to be part of that optimistic and responsible Britain that we court a a glimpse of this past summer. Achieving that places a great burden of responsibility on all of us, frankly, with a particular responsibility falling on David Cameron, who, after all, was the man who set up the inquiry. It inescapably falls to him to show serious leadership when Lord Justice Leveson publishes his recommendations in the next week or so. Will the Prime Minister hold true to his promise that we must find, in his words, an entirely new system for holding the press to account? Because, as he made clear when giving evidence before the Leveson inquiry, we must substitute independent regulation for self-regulation. And hopefully, on this occasion, he and the entire political class won't lose their nerve.